Engine Performance 2 Test 5, we're talking about meters because if you're going to troubleshoot anything that's got to do with engine performance, and a lot of stuff that you do goes around with, you just have to use a meter, right? And so if I was going to talk about an inductive amp meter, what principle do inductive amp meters work on?
A.
D.
Not B, so don't say
It's
that.
not
He
magic.
said D.
I know, I'm just.
He thought it was
Say
magic. What about the fact that a magnetic field surrounds any wire carrying current? Right? A meter used to measure amps is called a what? Amp meter without a space, coulomb meter, or an ammeter. What is a coulomb?
I don't-
You saw that.
Yeah?
You've seen that before because you went through that presentation that I'm gonna make him go through that presentation too, that you went through on basic electrical stuff.
Yeah.
You remember that word, C-O-U-L-O-M-B?
I mean, it looks familiar back at
That is a billion electrons, which is 1 amp.
What's the difference between A and B?
Basically, both of them are wrong, so it doesn't matter. Yeah. D is the right answer. Ammeter, right? And if you're going to wire up, if you're going to wire up a meter, an ammeter that's going to measure directly, you got to wire up, got to put it in series. Like if you were going to put it so that it would measure what's coming out of the alternator going to the battery, you would actually cut the wire and hook it to both sides of the ammeter, and it would read how many amps were flowing. A voltmeter should be connected to the circuit being tested. How so? Series, parallel, only when no power is flowing, or both A and C?
A and C.
Yeah, it's going to be B, buddy. You want power to be flowing, when you're measuring volts, right? Especially if you're measuring voltage drop, you want power to be flowing, right? Okay, an ohm meter should be connected to the circuit being tested. How? With current flowing? When connected to the battery of the vehicle to power the meter, only when no power is flowing, or both B and C?
B.
What do you think? That's C. But I'm going to tell you something too. Here's a really important rule of thumb. Let's say you were going to take an ohm meter and you were going to measure the resistance of a ground wire that traveled from the battery to the body of the car. Right? So you're going to go to scratch on that screw and you're going to go here and you're measuring that in ohms. If in other words, to the battery, like it goes to the battery cable, not the actual battery. But if you have the battery connected and you're measuring, even if you're measuring a short ground, if there's any current whatsoever flowing through that ground wire, it's going to cause your reading to be all fouled up. So what you need to do if you're going to measure ohms on any circuit on the car, you better take the battery out loose if you're measuring ohms. Not because you're going to damage your meter, but because you want an accurate reading, right? If you don't take that battery cable off, and some people argue with you about that, but I ran into it, and if the one time when it smacks you around and leads you in the wrong direction, you'll say, from now on, I'm taking the battery loose when I measure ohms on a car. Now, if you're unplugging a sensor and you're measuring just the two terminals in that sensor, that's fine. But if you're measuring a wire, then it's just smart to take the battery cable off so your meter doesn't pick up some whisper current that's going through that wire and give you a screwed up reading. High impedance meter. What is high impedance? What's that talking about? Can it measure high voltage? Does it measure a high amount of current flow? Does it measure a high amount of resistance? Does it have a high internal resistance? What do we got?
Is it A?
Number 5. It's actually D. It's got a high internal resistance. That test light that's laying on the table over there is a low impedance test light because it's going to carry a little bit of current to burn that bulb. Your high impedance test lights are going to be the ones with LEDs in them that they use almost no power at all, but they're going to indicate the current's there, right? So basically, when you hear high impedance, that means it's not going to cause the circuit to turn on. Now, why is that important? Here's another. If you can take that test light, and you remember when yesterday, Amber, you might remember seeing me do that when I was showing you about those relays when we were testing them. You could actually take the test light and connect it to ground. And if the other side of the coil on that relay was powered up, you could touch the tip of that test light to the other coil terminal, and that test light would energize that relay. You got me? Because that test light is a low impedance test light. So basically, if you're just wanting to see if there's power there, but you don't want to turn the relay on, you better have something like a meter, which is one of these little cheap meters that I keep around here, or a test light that's got an LED instead of a a bulb in it. And so just keep that in mind. All right, a meter is set to read DC volts on the 4-volt scale. The meter leads are connected to a 12-volt battery. The display will read what?
B.
If it's set to read DC volts on the 4-volt scale and it's connected to a 12-volt battery, the key here is what scale you're on. You're on a 4-volt scale and you hook to a 12-volt battery, what are you going to read?
D.
OL, which would be out of limit. Some people call it overload, but whatever. If it reads OL, that means that you need to go up a range. What could happen if the meter leads were connected to the positive and negative terminals of the battery while the meter leads were set to read amps? And I have preached about this ever since we picked up a meter in here. People hear me carry on about this. Get a brand new meter, and if you set it up, you plug it in to measure amps, and even if you don't put it on amps, if you set it measure it, and then you say, well, I'm going to hook it to the positive and negative terminals of the battery and see if it'll read. You either pop the fuse in the meter, which if it's a fluke meter, they're about $7 a piece for the dadgum fuses, or you destroy the little, $18 meter that we got here. Now, there's a reason why I have cheap meters here. You can actually, if you know where to buy them, buy these little meters like we use for about the same price of a fuse for a fluke meter. Also, these meters here are less likely to get stolen, right? And if somebody happens to burn one up or set fire to it or run over it with a car, it's not like they destroyed my fluke meter that was $350 or $400, right? So if you're going to be teaching a lot of people how to use meters, they're going to be blowing fuses left and right, because mechanics even do it. I've got a meter like that that's got a $7 or $8 fuse in it that I was using when I was in the field, but I was the only one that ever put my hands on it. But if you're using a bunch of, got a bunch of people handling meters, it's best to have cheap meters, or either that or have a big bag of them fuses, if you had 100 of them fuses, you'd spend $750 buying them. And you could go through them in a semester. Ain't that something? All right. Everybody that teaches is going to, have been there. Let me see. It's going to blow the internal fuse or damage the meter. That's what the answer to that one would be. The highest amount of resistance that can be read by the meter set to the 2,000 ohm scale is what? When I saw 2K, and it immediately rolled out of my mouth is 2,000. Okay, so what's the answer to that one going to be? 2,000 ohms, right? Duh. Everybody got that? All right.
What was that?
Huh?
What was that?
B.
If a digital meter face shows 0.93 when it's set to K ohms, which is 1,000 ohms, what does that reading mean?
C.
B? 930 ohms, right? Learn to read those meters. Something else I like about these little meters that we got is you have to select the range. Now, that may handicap you if you pick up an auto ranging meter, like that little brown one that belongs to me that I got in the office in there, because it's going to find a range and it's going to give you a number, but you better know what that number means. How can you tell on an auto ranging meter what the number means? Is it, how many ohms the meter has set itself for? It's going to have a little symbol up here. It'll either have ohms or K or M. Ohms would be just a little omega, Greek letter, and the K would be 1,000, and then M would be megohms, right? Millions. And so you learn to do that too, because when you take a reading, you got to hold the leads there long enough for it to get a reading. And when you look at it, if you see the reading and you misinterpret it, you could get in some hot water with your diagnosis. A reading of 432 shows on the face of a meter set on a millivolt scale. This reading means what? Ding, 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 ding,
A.
ding, ding, ding. What is it? It's A. Listen to him. He got that right. Okay. Which of these is safe for use in circuits with electronic components? LED test light. That's what I was talking about. Obviously, when you're checking, sensors and stuff that's got just a little tiny whisper of voltage going through it, you don't want to use a low impedance test light, because you're not going to get good results for one. And although most of your electronic components nowadays are fairly robust, in the early days you'd destroy things with that. All right, number 12, which device illuminates a different color when connected to power or ground sides of a circuit? I've showed you guys one of these logic probes. You got to hook it to power and ground. It's got a little light on it. It's real handy for seeing what you're doing. And when you touch it, if it lights green, you're looking at ground. If it lights red, you're looking at power. That's pretty good for working with power windows because you don't have to keep moving your thing there. If you were going to build one of those, if you were going to build a logic probe, you could actually take an LED that you buy from Radio Shack for not much money, and when you hook it up one way, it burns green, and you reverse the polarity, it burns red. That's pretty cool, right? Seen those before? Got 2 legs on it. All right, so what you can do is you can actually hook a resistor in series with that, put it in a little screwdriver handle, that you drill out the screwdriver. You can make you a logic probe. You can even put a little light in there if you want to, but you're going to have to hook it up to both sides of the battery for it to work. All right, let's see. Which device may be useful for testing Hall effect sensors? What would you think? A Hall effect sensor is just an on-off. Talked about those one time before.
Low power testing?
I'd probably use a logic probe on that. That's on number 13. Number 14, when using a digital multimeter, the black lead usually goes into which port? COM, VDC, 10A, or none of the above? Come on, guys. Are we going into deadhead mode again?
10A?
A? No, I might just go with
What do you think? 10A is 10 amps.
I think it's A.
It's right. A is right. Were you thinking it was A from the beginning, or did you just
No, I
pun?
was thinking it was A from the beginning, because see, I figured it was 10A was 10 amps, and I don't even know what the VDC is.
Volts, DC volts, you know that. The on the meter when you see the little symbols. Nowadays they actually, in addition to the letters and all, they put symbols, like ISO symbols and all that. This means what? What does this mean? What does this mean? That means ohms. This is AC volts. That's DC volts. Remember those symbols because you're going to see them over and over and over again. Frosty morn. All right. That always pops out of my mouth when I say over and over and over again. It's an old commercial for bacon years ago. All right, let me see here. Let me see. KHZ is a unit describing what property? Frequency, yeah. All right, ammeters should be connected how? How should they be connected? Like if you're going to have, I'm not talking about an inductive ammeter where you clamp it around a wire. And I mentioned this earlier in class if anybody was paying attention at all.
In series?
Yeah, good answer. In series, it's got to be, you got to go into it with one wire and back out of it. Now you don't hook it, once again, you don't hook an ammeter to the positive and the negative part lead on the battery, or the ammeter becomes the load and the smoke goes out of it. And you know what happens when the smoke goes out of something? You can't put the smoke back in. It doesn't work anymore. Right? And one time the big boss man came walking over there and he had a fuel gauge in his hand. The part that comes out of the dash from a 65 Galaxy that the used car guy was working on. And the fuel gauge wasn't working right. And he was wanting to know if I could test this. And I said, well, I can test it, but if I got to be careful on one like this, because if not careful, I'll let the smoke out of it. It won't work. And he says, let the smoke out of it. I've never heard that before. And the used car guy got really nervous because this was the big boss man. He goes, he's kidding. But anyway, I tested it and it was fine, and it turned out the sending unit was plugged in backwards. It just had 2 wires, the little, little rubbery thing, and somebody had just looked up there and seen 2 prongs sticking out and just plugged it in any kind of way. Well, if you saw that they were off center a little bit, you flip that thing around and plug it in, the gauge worked just fine. Now, on the older cars, that's the kind of stuff you'd run into, in the 60s. All right, let's see. Let me see where I'm at here. To prevent blowing the meter fuse in a digital multimeter, notice how they're hammering on this? What do you got to do? On number 17.
B.
Never test resistance of an energized circuit. What else? Install a fuse in line with the meter lead. That's a good idea. Put a fuse in the meter lead that will handle less amperage than the one inside the meter. And if it can measure 10 amps, put a 5 amp fuse in there. And that way, if you do accidentally touch it to something, it'll, pop that fuse. One day, my buddy Donnie was working over at the Ford place, and he had a meter, and for some reason, the shop manual had been written in a sort of a screwy way, and it was telling him to check a live circuit with his own meter, which would be a fired up circuit. He goes, I'm not supposed to check a live circuit with my own meter, but he was looking at the book, and this guy's a sort of a, go by the book kind of a guy. And he goes, but it tells me to check it. I didn't even know what he was thinking. I just saw him with his meter leads in his hand. And so he goes, I could damage my meter if I do this. Should I do this? But I'm told to do this. How am I going to gather this data if I don't do this? And so I happened to be walking by him holding a thing of bubble wrap, and about the time he touched the meter, the thing came out, and he goes, oh! He thought his meter had burned up. He says your timing was impeccable, He just, squeezed the bubble wrap. Okay, I didn't make a habit of doing that, but it just happened that way that time. You ever have bubble wrap and just pop it for the heck of it? Just because, not because you're trying to scare somebody, just trying to pop the bubble wrap. Let's see, what type of digital multimeter can measure current when clamped around a conductor? Talk to me, guys. Clamped around the conductor, what kind of meter is that?
B.
Wait a minute, were you listening to the first part of the test?
Inductive.
Inductive, that's right, read and think. Okay, number 19, the ability to measure AC current is useful when diagnosing what? Ding, ding, ding,
Starter motor operation.
ding, ding. If I'm going to measure AC
wait,
current,
resistance of battery cable.
well, alternator function, for one thing. I wouldn't use AC current to measure resistance in a battery cable. Alternator function is important to understand because the alternator is producing alternating current. That's why they call it an alternator. Now in the J1930 regulation, the way I understand it, you're supposed to call an alternator a generator if the PCM controls the field. There's been everybody's started calling it a generator, but if you go out to the automotive trade stuff, everybody's got an opinion as to why that is, but nobody can really point to any law that says that's got to be done that way, but one way or another, you're going to see in your shop manual called generator. That's alternator function. If you're checking that to see if you got diode issues, you'll be getting some alternating current out of the alternator, which is not supposed to be there, and that's what that was talking about. If it's a bad one, The internal resistance of any meter is effective only if the meter is set on which scale? The internal resistance of any meter is only effective if the meter is set on what? Voltmeter scales. Okay? Although, when I'm using an ohm meter, I'm going to touch those leads together, and whatever I get with the leads touched together, I'm going to subtract from the reading I get when I'm making my measurement. That's important too. I'm not sure where they were headed with that. But anyway, when measuring resistance, a reading of OL in the digital multimeter means what?
C.
Open circuit.
Yeah. Actually, yes and no. They did not give, this is a lousy question that's not written right. If you're measuring, we just said earlier that we were reading OL whenever we went to the 4-volt scale and hooked up to 12 volts, right? We were saying that. But in this particular case, they're not telling you what scale you're on. The only answer that can be right is an open circuit, right? And so that's what they would expect. The way they're saying the only answer that can be right is one you should do. I still don't like the way the question's written though. When interpreting meter readings in auto ranging mode, note the prefix indicated by the meter. Convert the reading prefix to base units if needed, both A and B, neither A and B. Well, we talked about that earlier. That's both A and B. Note the prefix indicated by the meter, which means it's telling you what range it has set itself on, and you're going to convert it to base units if needed. Okay, digital meters for automotive testing should include what? It need to have a diode tester, and you need to have DC amps at least up to 10 amps. There are some meters that were given to me for free, 5 of them that I've got in the box out there that we almost never use because they're only good for measuring 250 milliamps. I don't know why that's even there. Why you even put that range on there, I'm not sure. Which signal pattern in the RMS reading is the same as the average reading. And what does RMS stand for? Does anybody know what RMS stands for? If you can tell me what RMS stands for, I will give you 100 on this question. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of people listening to my voice right now, and a lot of people watching on television that don't know what RMS stands for. You could probably Google it, but it stands for root mean square. Root mean square. Yeah, root mean square. 24 is B, that's the sine wave. Right? You got that? That's a sine wave. Sine wave is basically the, the camel hump and all that stuff that we've been looking at over here. Okay, finally, our last little group of questions here. Which term is used to describe the resolution of a meter? What do you think?
B.
Counts in digits, both A and B. All right. When selecting a meter, accuracy ratings that are blank indicate more precise meters.
Higher.
Believe it or not, that's backwards. It's lower. Well, basically, you're going to zoom in there. When working on a hybrid vehicle, at least according to this, you'd think it would be higher accuracy, So you got to, we need to probably look into that in our text and make sure that the author is backing that up. Number 27, when working on a hybrid vehicle, which type meter is recommended?
C.
That's going to have to be a Cat 3 or 4, which is 600, to 1,000 volts on that. And number 28, this digital multimeter is set to read ohms. And what does this reading mean?
0.
That basically means that you don't have any continuity that can be read by that meter. Now, this is an auto ranging meter. And so basically, if it's showing OL, then that means that it doesn't have a range that can read what you're reading. If you may have your, out in the air. Okay, on this meter, this reading converts to what? What does it convert to?
A. No.
B.
How about it? Come on. Are you going to hear from somebody else? Does anybody need a lifeline? 3,124 ohms. Because it's K, so you got 3,000 ohms, and then 124 is, everything is down below that.
I hate when I second guess myself.
Huh?
I hate when I second
You got it right, and see, that's one of those questions you would have marked right and then scratched over it and marked it wrong, yeah? Don't you love that? All right.